So at this point, we have our donut service. We also have our array of data, but we've reached the point where if we were going to use this in many different places, this service, and reference our data set, we would be doing something like .find every single time. And it doesn't really leave our code in a nice state because we've got all this selection logic lying around inside of our component. And to me, it kind of clutters up our ng on init. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a perfectly acceptable approach. However, what I like to do is embrace this idea of a state selector. So what does a state selector mean? We've pretty much written it already. We want to select a piece of our state based on an ID. So here we've got an ID, this is our state, and we want to select it. So the underlying implementation is that we write some kind of find method. Now we also have our donut list. We have a selector, which is essentially just give me everything. It's give me the entire list. So we've got two different selectors, but we're kind of exposing the implementations. So what I want to explore is this idea of using a class method as a state selector to encapsulate our application state, or at least chunks of our state, that then correspond to certain features in our application and wrap them up nicely, hide their implementation inside of a class method. So this is where we come up with the pattern of CRUD. Create, read, update, and delete. So we're essentially using this retrieve, this read, where we're reading our data. So it probably makes sense for us to start with reading all of our data. That's going to be a nice, simple selector. So here we're going to create a method and we're going to call it read. And this is going to be a function that we then call if we want to go and get all of our data. So if we open up our service, we can scroll down instead of exposing our array, because at the moment we are leaving this as a public property. So we could change this across to a private property, which then means if we try and access it in here, you can see that we have property donuts is private and only accessible within the donut service. So what this does is stop developers, perhaps in your team, tampering with your code. It means that they won't directly start using your data, and we can then encapsulate it and hide it and leave the service completely in charge of managing that data. So what we want to do is just set up first that read method. So underneath our constructor, we can say read, and all we can simply say is return this.donuts. So that's pretty simple. That then returns us all of our data. We can press save. We can go back to our donut list. You can see that we're not having any red underlines. However, our donut single component is now having issues because we're accessing our private donuts property. So let's comment this out, jump into our application component. We'll switch this back to donut list, and you can see that we now have the exact same as we did before, but we're using this read where we're returning this .donuts. So what about our donut single? We have this idea of reading a single donut. We could say .read and then use array find, but what if we could do better than this? So let's ignore this code for the moment. We'll bump it down. And what if we add a method called read1? And we just simply passed in an ID. Now, instead of having a constant, I'm just going to break it out and pass it in as a string, just to keep things nice and readable. So what this essentially means is we want to put this logic now inside of the donut service. So let's take it out. We can immediately see that if you were a new developer joining the team, or perhaps you've just joined a different project, or you've come back to your own project, you now have a one-line piece of code that then goes and reads one particular item. So how do we implement this? We can jump into our service. We can say read1. We're going to then expect an ID of type string. And then what we're going to simply do is paste in our initial logic. So at this point, we could say return this.read, which is then going to return us our this.donut. So internally, our read1 is going to grab them all. Then it's going to go and find it. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and return an empty object. Now, instead of doing this OR operator, what we're going to do is make things a little bit neater. So we're going to copy this. We're going to return the donut. But before we do, we can paste in our code again. We can say const donuts equals this.read, go and find it. And then if we find a result, we can say if donut, then we want to, in fact, return it. And if we don't have a match, our donut is then not returned. So all we're going to do is return a completely empty object. We'll save this out. This then neatens things up. You can see that we have our read1 implementation. We can then hit save, go back into our app component, change our donut list back to donut single, and we have that item that we then passed in of our caramel swirl, which then, if we jump into our single, matches our read1. We can jump into the service. We can, of course, select another item, go back to the donut single, replace the ID, and this then re-renders upon save. So this is how we can use the idea of encapsulating a state selector inside of our service. We've got our data, and this is quite nice and neat. This is the place where the underlying implementation is then making sure that we are getting the pieces of data that we want. If we don't have it, we're going to return a brand new object, which means if we jump into our component again, we can add something that we know doesn't exist, and we then have a brand new form for us to then go and fill out. So I hope you like this, and I think this neatens up our component logic. Our ng on init is nice and clean, and this is going to set us up nicely for the rest of the course. We're then going to start talking about immutability and much more in the next couple of videos.